Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to the final class meeting of Edible Education 101 for 2020. It's been an extraordinary semester. I want to thank all of you for sticking with us and being adaptable as we have migrated from our wonderful large auditorium with all of its energy and closeness into this online format. And one of the maxims I like to follow in my life and in everything I do is start strong and finish strong. And you'll remember we started the semester with just an extraordinary class with Alice Waters and Bryant Terry with that beautiful cooking demo that Bryant did. And we took a deep dive into regenerative agriculture. We had Kathleen Merrigan, the former Deputy Secretary of the USDA. We had that wonderful class that Tiffany Patton led with Professor Wendy Silver and several local farmers focused on regenerative farming. We had that great class about the media and featuring Civil Eats and Naomi Starkman and several of her colleagues. We had Carla Vernone, the president of General Mills Natural and Organic Unit, talking about how big food might play a role in saving us. We had our student food systems change makers. I know many of you really enjoyed that class. And then we had our final in-class meeting with Karen Ross, the Secretary of Agriculture, and Anthony Mayint and Karen Leibovitz from Restore, California. And that was back in early March. And that was the last time we were gathered together. Little did we know that the pandemic would really wash over all of our lives like a big tidal wave. And here we are in little boxes. If I was really motivated, I would do a little mime for you, like I'm stuck in a box. But, well, since it's the last class, I will do just a little bit of that. But tonight is a special night. We have the originator of Edible Ed, Michael Pollan, is going to be with us in just a few minutes. Before we get started, with that part of the class, we'd like all the UC Berkeley students to participate in our course evaluation. It takes about 10 minutes. It's a few questions that gauge your interest and satisfaction and your feedback on the class. And it matters a lot to me and the teaching team, who I am grateful to for all of their really noble and engaged support and flexibility this season. And I also want to thank our audiovisual team headed up by Eric Mayer, who's been assisting us to accommodate a much larger community to this class than a normal UC Berkeley class. So I'm going to introduce our class rep, Lila Adler. And Lila is going to give you the link for the course evaluation. I understand this year that there are a few new questions on the evaluation that have to do with your online experience. So please do fill this out. It means a lot to me and the university, and your feedback is also really kind of a key indicator of the value that you perceive from this class. And as you know, this is our 9th year, and we are keen to keep it going. Tonight, we're going to use the chat. Some of you submitted questions for Michael ahead of time, and you'll get a chance to answer and question and answer with him. And let me just go and show you one more image here to talk about. So let's do a quick poll to do attendance real quickly. Here is the poll. If you're a Haas student, please take this poll. How do you think your meat eating will change this summer? Multiple choice. No change at all. I'll be eating less meat this summer. I'll be incorporating meat as a condiment in main dishes more often, a la Dan Barber. I'm giving up meat. I'll be eating as much meat as I can get my hands on. Okay, well, this is interesting. We have about 150 people reporting in. And I'm going to stop the poll in just about 30 seconds and share it with you. And I'm just looking for, there's Michael. He is here. Good. All right, let's end the poll and I'll show you the results. You can see 56% say they'll be eating less meat this summer. And some of you are not going to make any changes, and a few of you are even going to give it up. So I think that information will be useful in our conversation tonight. Just to remind you, use the chat tonight if you have questions, and Fiona and I will do our best to facilitate the questions with Michael and Alice. I wanted to remind you about being bamboo. So today I was out in the garden and the bamboo's become incredibly invasive. I told you last week that one of the reasons bamboo is so deeply grounded and flexible is because it puts out these amazing root systems, both vertically and horizontally. And this is what the horizontal rhizomes look like. And they grow in all kinds of overlapping strands to almost make their own tapestry. So it's an incredibly strong carpet. That's the good news in terms of its strength. The challenge is that it's incredibly invasive. Those rhizomes will just grow to wherever there's water, and those roots can just choke out anything. So I have become pretty conscientious about trying to limit this, even though I have a barrier in place. All right, let's get on with our evening. So as you know, this class is about becoming a food systems change maker. We focused on values, systems, and action. And throughout the semester, we've developed our food systems intelligence about how everything is connected. And the pandemic has definitely shed a lot of light on the vulnerabilities in the food system and amplified a lot of the inadequacies of the food system, to the effect that really food is on the front page of the paper every day now. And so we're really fortunate tonight to have our founding I want to say mother and father of this class, Alice and Michael, to be with us. And I wanted to welcome Alice back from her to the class. It was wonderful to have her with us for the first class in person and throughout the semester. And I'm going to give her the honor of introducing Michael. So maybe, Eric, you could take Alice off of mute. That would be fantastic. There we go.
Well, I don't think that Michael needs any introduction to any of you. But I have to say that if he hadn't taken this idea almost 10 years ago in the School of Journalism, we wouldn't be where we are now in the business school with you, Will. It's so amazing what's happened, the arc of this course. And of course, we hope it's a class that will go throughout the University of California and across the country. But I talked to Michael last night and he said, the only thing I'm really going to miss is seeing all the citrus there and being able to take some home with me. So I brought you a bowl of citrus, Michael. And I'm going to take it and I'm going to put it on your front porch tonight. So you're going to have a few citrus. I think they're the last of the quiches from Jim Churchill's farm in Ohio, and a little Rangpur lime leaf on the side. But we're so happy you're here tonight, and I look forward to hearing everything you say, as always.
Thank you, Alice. And without further ado, it's our pleasure to introduce probably the preeminent spokesperson, writer, journalist of the food movement for many, many years, a professor at the journalism school, both at Berkeley and Harvard, our friend and guest tonight, Michael Pollan. Are you there, Michael?
Yeah, I just got unmuted. Thank you, Will, and thank you, Alice, for the fruit. I mean, this is a class that, you know, when I think of teaching it virtually, just fills me with sadness because of the fruit bowl and a few other things. But it's wonderful to be here with everybody remotely, and I have a real soft spot in my heart for this particular class. And what an honor to be here at the last session.
Well, it's great to have you, and we're grateful for your time tonight. It's nice to get a chance to be in your study with you.
Yeah,
so,
this is my study. I'm sorry about the lighting. It's like, I mean, I see on Alice too, it's the same sun. There's a very powerful late afternoon sun that's like raking across my face, but hopefully it'll mellow in a little bit.
Well, you've had a number of inquiries and adventures that you've been writing about and speaking about since we saw you last with your book, How to Change Your Mind, which was a phenomenal awakening for many people. And then your recent audio book about coffee. And now you're back in the throes of writing about the food system again, and the food chain, the buckling food chain.
Yeah, I haven't been, you know, the last couple of years I've been writing more about psychedelics, mental health, consciousness. And then I did this audiobook on caffeine, which is a long piece about both coffee and tea and the chemical that they have in common. And in a way, caffeine is kind of the bridge between my food work and my psychedelic work. You know, all these things are plants and fungi we take into our bodies that change us in various ways. So for me, there's a kind of interesting continuity between food and psychedelics. And they're also, you know, I'm very interested in health, mental health and physical health. And psychedelics has emerged as a really important tool for mental health treatment, much to many people's surprise. But I still follow food issues closely. I feel less obligation to devote my work life to covering them, in large part because there's so many good journalists now in the space. You know, back when I published Omnivore's Dilemma in 2006, it was like, you know, Eric Schlosser and me and Marion Nessel, and it was a pretty short list of people who were really taking it seriously as a beat. And now, I mean, you had Naomi Starkman on from in the class earlier. I was there, and her crew. And you know, you've got some brilliant journalists there, and you have the people at Fern, the Food and Environment Reporting Network, and it's just exploded as beat. So I feel like other people are taking good care of it. Civil Eats coverage of COVID-19 has been spectacular. Fern has done a great job covering what's going on in the meat industry right now, which is really shocking, and as you say, has become a front page story. But I did feel I wanted to weigh in on this because I think that the pandemic, as you suggested, is laying bare many aspects of the food system. You know, for years, people like, you know, me and Eric and Wendell Berry and Alice Waters have been saying that the system is unsustainable. That's not just an aesthetic judgment, like we don't like it. It means that there are internal contradictions that sooner or later are going to produce breakdowns. And well, sooner and later are here. And the pandemic is producing breakdowns. We see it in the meat plants that are closing. 150 meat plants, I think, have closed. 12,000 meat plant workers have been infected, many of whom are still forced to go to work. And 20 or 30 of them have died. So what was that about? Well, it was about, and then as a result, by the way, all these meat farmers, animal farmers, had nowhere to take their animals when they're ready for slaughter. And so they're euthanizing them on the farm by the millions. Chickens, pigs are simply being killed because they can't be processed. And this at a time when the food bank cupboards are bare. So that's just a colossal disaster, I think, for the meat part of the food system. But it isn't surprising, because when you concentrate your meat industry to the extent we have, to the extent where 4 companies slaughter 85% of the beef cattle, there's no resilience in the system. So you have this system where, let's say you're a pig farmer and you've contracted your pigs to go to the Smithfield plant in Sioux Falls, Iowa, sorry. And when that plant closes down because they have hundreds of COVID-19 cases, you're stuck, and your pigs are getting bigger, and they're getting too big to be slaughtered. And the baby pigs are coming along, growing as they will. And so you kill your pigs. It's just a horrible situation. But if you think about it, if we hadn't concentrated the industry to this extent, if there were still hundreds, if not thousands, of regional meat plants, a breakdown in one of them would not have made the news at all. It would not have been a big deal. So concentration gives you great efficiency, and the price of meat is very cheap in America. People can eat meat, 3 times a day, and many people do. But the price of this efficiency is a loss of resilience, and I think that's one of the aspects of the food system that's being exposed. And there are a bunch of others, but that one is top of mind right now.
In the new,
why is Emmy Maluga's name on my screen? Oh, it just went away.
I don't know.
You're back.
In the new piece that you're working on that you shared with me, you point out that we've got these supply chains, one dedicated to grocery stores, one dedicated to food service, basically restaurants and large scale feeding operations like we have at Cal, or that corporations have in their cafeterias, and that these 2 supply chains basically are completely discrete and don't communicate or interact.
Yeah, that's an amazing phenomenon that I didn't really understand completely. We have, there's 2 food markets in America. There's this institutional market, which is schools and corporations and restaurants, big restaurants. And there's a group of farmers that feed into that chain, and they sell their produce in bulk, or their meat in, whole sides or whatever it is. And it's a certain set of companies that specialize in that distribution chain. And then you have this other group of farmers. There's some overlap, but it's really a distinct group. And they are selling into the grocery store chain. So when you had the economy collapse and people stopped going to work and stopped going to school, that whole food chain that supplied those institutions collapsed. And all that food had nowhere to go. And that's why you saw those images of millions of gallons of milk being thrown out, and farmers, digging ditches to put all their onions and leeks in and just destroy it, because there was no easy way to reroute that food to the grocery stores, which needed it, or the food banks, which needed it. And that's because it was a different world with different contracts, different contacts, different corporations, different packaging, different grading. I tell the story of an egg producer who was a giant egg producer, I think in Pennsylvania. and he was feeding the market for liquefied eggs. So he was selling eggs by the, I don't know what, by the millions to Cargill, who was turning it into these, you know, eggs sold in containers to be turned into omelets and scrambled eggs at, you know, Cal Dining or whatever. And suddenly that market disappeared, but he didn't have the grading equipment or the boxes or the contacts or the contracts to send that into the supermarket food chain where eggs were flying off the shelves. So that's another kind of brittleness. You know, you specialize, you achieve incredible efficiencies this way. You can move a lot of eggs for very little money. But when push comes to shove, you want a little more suppleness. You want some resilience in your economy. And redundancy gives you that. And that's what I think we've removed from the food system.
So those are the two large industrial tracks of the supply chain. We also have kind of a vital series of local supply chains in communities. We're very lucky in Northern California to have one of the most robust in the country. So we get a little bit of a different view of that. But a lot of the farmers that we've been talking to have been able to pivot from
Yes.
their restaurant sales to direct to consumer.
Yeah, I mean, the small regional farmers seem to be adjusting. I mean, some of them are struggling, as is everybody. But I mean, you know, a great example is right here. I mean, Alice is, you know, has a group of farmers that provide much, if not most, of the produce to Chez Panisse. They suddenly lost their most important market, and she turned around and created a CSA where, you know, on Sundays you can pick up a box of really fine produce and various grocery items. So that all that good food has been rerouted to individual consumers who, guess what, are cooking at home and can make good use of produce. So there has been, I think the regional food systems are more redundant and they're more flexible and they are adjusting. The farmers markets too have adjusted, at least here. I know they're having trouble in LA, but in Berkeley, they've kind of figured out social distancing at the farmers market. Everything is touchless. I was able to use my Apple Pay to buy everything at the market, which I've never been able to do before. So no money changed hands. Everybody was, you know, masked and incredibly careful. And that system seems to be, you know, adjusting and the shelves are full. But I worry about that too, because even those regional farmers are dependent on, very often on migrant farm workers. And, you know, migration all around the world is grinding to a halt. Seasonal migrations, because borders are closing, because people are afraid of getting sick. And so I worry about what happens this summer and fall if the flow of guest workers dries up, or if President Trump tries to choke it off, which we know he's eager to do. He's up against Big Ag, which is like screaming at him that they need their guest workers. And he understands guest workers because, of course, all his resorts depend on guest workers also. You know, they're seasonal. But I think there's more trouble coming. You know, I worry that we'll look back at this moment where the farmers markets are full of beautiful produce, and the grocery stores still have a lot of produce, and they're bare shelves. You know, if you're looking for pasta or sauce, it's hard to find. That seems to be the default for a lot of people. But that I think we may look back on this as the good old days, and that this fall, that these problems with the supply chain may get worse. Meat certainly is going to be in short supply, at least industrial meat.
Well, Wendy's just announced that they're actually not serving burgers in 100 of their locations. So that's,
wow, I hadn't seen that.
Yeah, that's
amazing.
Development. So that is interesting to kind of prepare ourselves for the potential for the worst is yet to come.
You know, I think shopping is going to get a lot like it was in the former Soviet bloc, you know, and it is to some extent now. I mean, we drink oat milk, we don't drink, you know, cow's milk now. And when we go into Monterey Market shopping, we're very excited when we score our oat milk and we buy a couple cartons. And, you know, that's how people felt in the Soviet Union when they found, you know, and people still feel that way now about toilet paper. If they could find a roll of toilet paper, it's like it's an achievement. And I just have a feeling that that approach to shopping is going to become more common as the summer goes on.
One of the things that is so challenging is just living with all of the contradictions that are playing out. We introduced this concept of creative tension, you know, in the class, of sort of the tension between two things that might be true at the same time. And but the number of contradictions that seem to be evolving, like you just talked about, the, you know, the surplus of food on one hand, and then the hunger, you know, on the other. The directive that we should all be wearing masks, and then our top two leaders in the country do not, you know, model this behavior. That immigration should be shut down, but at the same time, the president's using this Defense Act to keep the meat plants open. So,
well, that is I mean, that is one of the most outrageous things that have happened during the pandemic. Let me just talk about that for a second, what that's about, because this happened last week. And what happened first was that John Tyson, the president of Tyson Foods, which is the second largest meat packer in America, a very powerful company based in Arkansas, took out an ad in several newspapers, I think the Washington Post, the New York Times, saying the food system is breaking and that there are going to be disruptions to the meat supply. This, of course, got the attention of the president, to whom it was intended, for whom it was intended. And he proceeded to use the Defense Production Act, which gives him unusual powers to preempt local authorities and preempt corporate governance, to in the interest of national security. This is an act he did not invoke to boost a production of tests for COVID. Okay, he just declined to do it. He wanted the free market to work. Here, he's doing it for meat at the behest of the meat industry, and they declared that meat was a structural necessity to American life. I should find the quote for you, but it was a hilarious description of meat, given what you've been talking about. Okay. He declared with this executive order that meat is a scarce and critical material essential to the national defense. Okay, that's what meat is now. And this act essentially forced the meat workers to go back to work, even though they are frightened, reluctant, getting infected, as I said, by the thousands. He basically wanted to take authority away from the governors, who he's charged with taking care of the whole COVID problem, and the local health authorities, who had closed down these meat plants because they were a hazard to their communities. But now the meat workers are forced back on the line so that we can have this, this product that's absolutely essential to our national defense. It's just deplorable.
You know, this class continues to attract students, hundreds of students from across the campus with very different areas of focus for their studies. And in the latter part of your piece, you ask this question about, you know, do we have the will, do we have the commitment to make the kinds of changes, you know, at this moment? It seemed that you were implying that, you know, in this moment of all of these weaknesses being exposed, that there's perhaps a new leverage point. And I think, in my experience, if there's any group of people that I've been inspired by, it's the people that take this class and that have taken it for the last 9 years, because as you know, your students and my students and Alice's students, they all go, many of them go off and, you know, they insert themselves as leading nonprofits or companies or working on policy. And, you know, maybe I would love to hear what advice you're giving your students and how you're preparing your students to actually seize this moment of opportunity and get out there and make change?
Well, I do think there is a moment here. One of two things will happen after this pandemic. We will be so eager to go back to status quo ante that we'll forget everything that we learned. That's my cynical take on it. My more hopeful take is that there is the opportunity here to build a whole new politics, and it will be in the Democratic Party. It will not be in the Republican Party, obviously, around addressing all the problems that the pandemic has exposed. There's a wonderful, famous Warren Buffett quote that a lot of your business students will know that goes, "Only when the tide goes out do you discover who's been swimming naked." Well, we've seen a lot of naked butts in the last couple weeks, and we're going to see a lot more. The whole treatment of so-called essential workers, right? I mean, this term, which you never heard, has been, it's on everybody's lips. These are the heroes. We have gratitude. These are the people, the food workers and the health workers and the people going to work every day while we stay home and shelter in place. And there is this weird paradox that these so-called essential workers are the most abused, mistreated, and underpaid in our economy. How can both things be true? How have our values gotten so screwed up that we treat people essential as essentially disposable? And that needs to be addressed. And that goes for food workers, that goes for all kinds of, people still picking up the garbage. I mean, the fact that society has not broken down when we have, 30 million unemployed is a credit to all those people who still have to go to work every day. And so if there was ever a moment to understand why they should get paid more, and why they should have health insurance and sick pay, because when they have it, we benefit. The whole idea that health insurance is this good that gets unevenly distributed at a time when our health is deeply interconnected with one another in a way it never has. I mean, if workers don't have sick pay, they're going to work on your food when they're sick. They have no choice. So I see an opportunity for a politics around this, and I do think it will be an important time to push. I see some signs that the Biden group is, starting to think this way, and that it is a moment like the Great Depression where you can move society and change the usual array of forces preventing change and reform. And in the food system, it argues for not only paying those workers better and giving them benefits and health insurance and sick pay, but it also argues for deindustrializing the food system, decentralizing the food system to the extent we can. It's not going to be complete, but we should understand in the same way, even Republicans now understand that it's maybe not a good idea that your essential medical supplies are all produced in a country you're fighting with called China. That maybe it's really good if you can produce your pharmaceuticals yourself and your N95 masks yourself. We should understand that region by region, it's very good that we're able to produce our own food, and that what the problems Tyson runs into in Sioux Falls, Iowa, doesn't become a national problem. That we need to basically encourage people to support local food systems and build them up as a matter of, I mean, if meat is tied to national security, surely local food systems have a much better argument that they are part of our national security. And I think it also, so it argues for antitrust action against big companies, and not just food companies, by the way. I mean, I think that we're seeing that our dependence on Amazon has become very troubling. And also, I think that we need to look at our agricultural policies. Right now, we have a set of agricultural policies enshrined in the Farm Bill that focus entirely on production on the amount of calories rather than the quality of calories. So we make it very easy to grow lots of corn and soy, which, by the way, is the one aspect of the agricultural economy that's fine. The corn and soy went in, the corn and soy will be harvested. Unfortunately, and the reason is because one farmer can, take care of thousands of acres of it's a really good social distancing part of the industry, because it's one farmer on a tractor can do thousands of acres, plant and fertilize and harvest with a combine. So that, unfortunately, all that is not food. It's animal feed, and it's the ingredients for fast food, right? For high fructose corn syrup and processed foods, which will not disappear from our shelves, sorry to say. So what if our agricultural policies were designed around health metrics, health of the population and health of the land? That, it seems to me, would build in a little more resilience in this sector. Because one last area that I'm very concerned about, and I address in this piece, which hasn't come out yet. In fact, I just pressed the button and submitted it to a magazine, so hopefully it will come out, is that we're learning that the Western diet, this diet high in meat, processed food, sugar, refined carbohydrates, that this diet is, and I have to draw this chain a little bit, but is making us more vulnerable to COVID-19. And what I mean by that is that if you look at the risk factors for being hospitalized for COVID-19, that is to say, having a severe case, you find that they are hypertension, which is in about 50% of cases, obesity, about 48% of cases, type 2 diabetes, I think it's 25 or 30% of cases. If you have any of those three things, the chances become much greater that you will end up in the hospital and possibly die from COVID-19. Now, what do those things have in common? Well, on the one side, they're all chronic diseases that we know are linked to diet. People who eat the Western diet are far more likely to suffer from hypertension, from type 2 diabetes, and from obesity. On the other side, so why is that? What's the connection? Why would a bad diet predispose you to COVID-19? Well, the Western diet is inflammatory. Those three, it produces body inflammation, chronic inflammation, which is to say a heightened sense of stress and immune response in your body. And hypertension and obesity and type 2 diabetes are all symptoms of an inflammation. And obesity contributes to it also. And it appears that what's going on when you get a really bad case of COVID-19 is that your immune system is overreacting. It's hypervigilant, and it's leading to what are called cytokine storms that finally destroy your lungs and destroy your organs, other organs. And in fact, a really interesting finding that just came out of China, this hasn't been peer reviewed yet, but I saw a preprint of it, was a study of hospital patients with COVID-19 in Wuhan. And they found that one of the most reliable predictors for an adverse event, i.e. death, in a serious case, was elevated levels of C-reactive protein, which is a marker of inflammation. And when you get a blood test, often your doctor looks at your CRP score. And high CRP scores predicted bad outcomes. And we also know that a bad diet raises your CRP score. So you see there, it's all connected. Once again, I mean that this food system, we know it kills us slowly, and sometimes it kills us rather swiftly. And I think that may be what's going on now.
Well, what's interesting too with the reopening, I've been trying to track the narratives. And one of the narratives that the White House has been putting out is, this is temporary. It's going to go away. We're going to be back to normal before you know it. Back to normal.
Yeah.
most informed people say there is not going to be a return to normal. As a matter of fact, the public health leader in Sonoma County has intentionally not given any kind of end date to the shelter in place and refuses to, which I think is an interesting strategy, because basically what she's saying is, this is not going to be over. This is just going to evolve. And so don't get your hopes up that I'm going to come up with some day that I'm going to tell you, you know, that it's going to be back to normal. So I'm interested in the narratives, the stories that are told to prepare people for a new life. And
yeah, I don't think our leaders are prepared to tell that story. You know, even Gavin Newsom, who, you know, has done, you know, heroic work closing down California, you know, earlier than any other state. And in fact, the health commissioners in the Bay Area were even ahead of him. They did it on, I think, the 13th or 14th of March, which took real courage. But he too seems to be invested in this, you know, opening narrative, that we will open things up and there'll be these four stages. And they're certainly a lot more reasonable than what's going on in some states. But I think a decision has essentially been made, at least in the administration, to let the death rate rise dramatically. Hope you can get enough economic improvement to, you know, help with the election. You know, I mean, it's, you know, you have the president talking about opening, despite the fact that all these openings defy the standards set out by his administration, that you should wait to have 14 days of declining numbers. You know, it's irresponsible in the extreme. I mean, there might be you know, a return to normalcy, but it won't happen until there's a vaccine. I don't see how it happens until there's a vaccine.
well, connecting this back to your earlier point about essential workers, we basically see data now of who's impacted by the virus. The administration's basically saying we're going to have to live with, you know, a certain number of deaths. Those deaths are distributed disproportionately amongst communities of color and people who have, you know, pre-existing conditions.
That's absolutely right. And, you know, African Americans are dying at twice the rate of whites. And why is that? Well, I mean, there are a lot of reasons, but one of the things that raises inflammation is stress. And it's very stressful being an African American in a racist country. And we've seen, you know, people have studied this. And then you also have the fact that hypertension is very common in the African American community. Related to stress and bad diet and high rates of obesity and access to healthcare. If you don't have good access to healthcare, you don't know that you're hypertensive. You know, there are no symptoms that people feel. You have to be tested for it, and it's not hard to treat, but you have to have healthcare. So yeah, I mean, you know, look, I think there are a lot of people in the Republican Party who are looking at the map of this disease and deciding it's a Democrat problem. Because that's where it started, you know, on the coasts, and that there are all these red states where it hasn't been a problem. Well, guess what? That's changing right now. So, you know, this is going to kill Trump voters as much as it's killing, you know, Biden voters. Yeah, I mean, well, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole. But,
that's okay.
It's
so
really important to have elections.
Yeah, let's go back to the tracks of action that we're identifying. So, you know, one track as eaters are the choices that we can make, our families can make, our every day to be intentional about where we want to spend our money, and in spending our money, supporting the food system that we want to have. That means we have to give up some sort of habits or some things we might be engaging in that are opaque. I mean, every time we buy a Tyson chicken, we're effectively supporting the food system that is now coming apart and mistreating people. If we can work with people that we have met and know, we are, you know, participating more actively. So we have our individual choices, and then we also have our, as you're saying so beautifully in this piece, you know, we have to have a political will. We have to be engaged locally, regionally, and in some capacity nationally to influence policy.
And I think that, I mean, you know, one of the ironies of this election is that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party lost, but their policies look prescient. You know, universal health care or Medicare for all, obviously. I mean, now that people are losing their health care when they get fired or laid off, you know, the whole idea of tying your health care to your employment, as we do in America, suddenly looks like a stupider idea than it ever was. And ditto Elizabeth Warren's talk about breaking up these big companies. You know, so we can hope and we can push for the Biden candidacy to adopt some of those policies. And fortunately for us, whatever you think of Joe Biden, he doesn't have a lot of strong commitments to an ideology. So I think he will move with the center of the party. But electoral politics are very, very important here.
Yes.
And so that's another way to get involved. I mean, I think there's an opportunity for students next fall. You know, if we're still learning online, if, you know, we don't convene as a university in the fall, there are many students who aren't going to want to come back. And with good reason. You know, I mean, everybody knows now it's not the same, and there's so much more than classes that take place in a university education, and there's so much that students aren't getting. And it's totally understandable that somebody would say, you know, if they're not meeting live, I'm going to do something else. Well, there's a political campaign to work on, a whole bunch of them, a Senate at stake, a presidency at stake. And it seems to me that would be a very good use of one's fall semester. And I think the university should give people credit for doing that. I mean, I think that public service, which consists of, you know, doing politics and also organizing workers and fighting for the rights of, you know, Amazon employees and fighting for the rights of meat packing employees and food workers, the kind of work that Saru Jayarama is doing. This is really important work, and maybe this fall is a good time to take a break and do it.
I like that idea a lot. And I know you and I and other faculty members have always been supportive of kind of applied experiential learning. I mean, we want the students to have the opportunity to interact in the communities, in the political sphere, in the business community now. And so I like that idea, and I think we should propagate it and see.
Yeah, and I think the university should really support it. I mean, because you know, this is an emergency, and the University of California could take a stance that public service now is to be rewarded for this period of time as much as academic achievement. And I don't know exactly how you do that, and you know, it may be terrifying to some parents who are listening in. But it seems to me that there's an opportunity here, rather than having a watered down education for a semester, to get that kind of hands-on practical education, doing politics, and also other things, you know, I mean, helping out at food banks and you know, helping to shop for people who can't go out, the elderly. You know, there's a whole lot of work to be done, and also helping out on these farms that are, you know,
Sure.
I mean, it's a great summer to have a farm internship and help harvest when we're really going to need all that labor.
Well, you're really touching on a couple of things that are definitely proven to support mental well-being, which is being in nature. You know, we talked about that. We had a class actually on gardening this semester, and one of the assignments was right before we were all locked up to get out into a garden. And also just to be of service. There is something truly renewing about being of value and service to people who are in need. So,
and this is a very unusual historical moment. I mean, you know, some of your students perhaps haven't been around long enough to realize when there is a turning point in history, when something that will define a generation, will define this period, is taking place. And that's happening right now. There will be before pandemic and after pandemic in our politics, in our culture, in the arts, and in the food system. And to fully engage with that process, to put your bodies into nudging the result one way and not another, is something that I think you'll look back on as a really worthwhile investment of time.
I love that, counsel. I mean, one of the things we've just talked about a lot in the theme of kind of social entrepreneurship, which is woven through the class now, is just the importance of showing up. And, just showing up. And Jose Andres, when he was here a couple weeks ago, he just demonstrated that so vividly, that the fact that he would travel to these hot spots, the symbolism and the call to action that makes. And I think what you're saying, Michael, is that each of us can do that on an individual basis and have an impact. We shouldn't underestimate the impact that showing up.
No, there's so many different ways, and there are people, inventing right now, inventing new businesses and new ways to, I see leaflets on telephone poles as I walk around town with new services that they're offering and that are very specific to this moment. And what Jose Andres has done is, it's very similar. He's taken a series of disasters. They were all regional disasters until now. Now we have a global disaster. And he dropped what he was doing and threw himself into it. And it's been a beautiful thing to witness. And there's room for a lot more Jose Andres.
I like to just also encourage the students not to get caught up in feeling that they're in a Berkeley bubble, because the culture of Berkeley is in many ways aligned in a way that cultural change can manifest. And the trends, particularly trends around health and wellness, trends around healthcare, they begin, a lot of them, right where we are. We're in the epicenter of this. So the international community that we bring together at Berkeley has a huge potential to, ripple back and influence. And I think this idea of in this culture, in this moment, with the way the media is structured, the ability to kind of authentically and ethically lead and influence is so potent and so important. And it's almost an area that all students should be learning, whether they're studying the sciences. They also need to know how to translate the science into the stories that influence. And I know you've worked a lot on that in your classes of helping people.
Well, the storytelling is one way that people can contribute. I think part of it is we can't all contribute in the same way. We all have different skills. Jose Andres has a very different skill set than I do, or you do, or Alice does. And so I think part of it is doing that inventory on yourself and what do you have to contribute. For some people, and I teach a lot of journalists, it's going out and telling the story, digging out the story. I have a student right now who's working like a dog to get inside, both literally and figuratively, Amazon warehouses, where there is a lot of COVID. And anyone who uses Amazon knows that their supply chain is like buckling. Things don't show up in a day anymore. They've hired 175,000 new workers. And he feels, by telling that story of what the workers are dealing with, and how they're being, encouraged to show up even when it's at high risk, is the best way to advance that labor movement. But everybody's got a different gift to bring to the table here, and part of the process is figuring out what yours is.
So taking that personal inventory and sort of looking at the intersection of where your passion is, your skill set, and maybe I always like to remind young people that one thing leads to another. We don't have a grand strategy for life generally, but sometimes serendipity
Yeah.
plays its
I
hand.
think that is a giant misconception of young people, that we have all been on a, following a plan, that there was a battle plan designed one day, and Alice Waters was going to start a restaurant, and she just did, step 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I was going to be a writer, writing about food and psychedelics, and you were going to start a tea company and then move on to other things. No, I mean, there's so much serendipity, and that's a polite word for it, just accident, luck. Yeah, no, I think part of
and the generosity of others, really.
absolutely, breaks that people give you, but also just kind of like taking opportunities when they arise. Just say, oh, I'm going to try that. Here's this thing I didn't think I was interested in, but I'm going to give that a try. And no, I didn't plan to be a writer. I mean, I had literary aspirations, but I didn't know anyone who made a living as a writer. There was nobody in my circle. So I set out to become an editor, magazine editor, because I liked writing and I liked hanging out with writers, and there was a paycheck, unlike writing. Nor did I think I'd be a professor. But things happen along the way, and you have to be very alert to opportunity and be willing to take some chances, knowing that failure is part of the process, and failure is educational and interesting, and actually sometimes speeds things along. One of the things I noticed in my career is that my friends, often with Ivy League education, who got the fancier jobs at the famous magazines, they kind of, got stuck at a certain tier of fact checker or whatever, and they were there for years and years and years. And I worked at a series of magazines that just flopped, some of them in as short as 9 months. So I was constantly getting new jobs, but you move much more quickly when you get new jobs. So yeah, so working for scrappy startups is often a lot more rewarding when you're young and you don't have a mortgage and you don't have, a big monthly nut. That's the time to take those kind of changes. Which
I like this idea of empowering our students at this moment to acknowledge that they might have had a plan.
Yeah.
And there's a moment to adapt, and there's a moment to really show up and learn and make a difference right now in a very meaningful way.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a path.
All plans are up in the air right now, and that's very uncomfortable, I think, to a lot of people. There's a lot of security in having a plan, and knowing, are you going to be in school in September? Is there going to be school in September? But I'm afraid one of the skills we're going to learn is, what Keats, speaking of Shakespeare, called negative capability, the ability to exist without reaching for certainty. And it's actually a very important life skill. And I think we're going to be forced to learn it if we haven't already.
Yeah. I'd like to invite a couple of the students to pose some questions. And Jonathan Mendelson, if you're there, if you want to come on and unmute yourself and address your questions to Michael,
yep.
We'd welcome that.
I'm here. Thanks, Will.
Hey, Jonathan.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Great. Thanks for coming. So my question is, it seems like a lot of people believe that big business is solely profit-driven and CSR is basically just appeasement, as we see maybe with the Tyson case, while others think that...
Wait. What does CSR stand for? Corporate
social responsibility. Yeah. And others seem to think that recoursing massive supply chains is probably the most practical way to affect change in the food system. So I was wondering where your thoughts are on where on the spectrum we should be aiming toward, or if you have any thoughts on the evolution of the food system from the perspective of big business.
Yeah, so, a lot of my work or thinking about reform has focused on what the government can do. I've focused on agricultural policy. I put a lot of effort into trying to push the Obama administration, which was, well disposed toward the food movement, but in the end didn't do a whole lot. And so I put a lot of effort there. But I do recognize the potential of corporations to drive a lot of reform, especially at a time when the government is essentially hostile to food system reform. And for the last few years, if any change is going to happen, we're going to be dependent on corporations to drive it. And there are many corporations who see that the system does need to change. They have their own reasons to do it. You have companies that are trying to drive down their carbon footprint, and so they're looking at food as an important way to do that. So I'm very interested in that, but I always worry about what happens when those changes cost more money. What happens when they reduce return on investment? And my worry is that, that the reforms give way. I mean, I had a long history of engaging with Walmart about changing their practices and the kinds of foods they put in. We had the head grocery buyer of Walmart, Jack Sinclair, came to this class a couple years ago, and in the end, I mean, the Walton family was very interested in reform, and they're very interested in reducing their carbon footprint. But then you get a new leadership, and economy turns south, and the commitment kind of vanishes. So how do you sustain that through multiple administrations in a company is another issue. I think the whole idea of triple bottom line is interesting and worth exploring. I think, though, that, activism on the outside can force change in companies for PR reasons. Look at all the companies and institutions that are getting out of the fossil fuel business because it's just become a shitty business. Why has it become such a shitty business? Not because we're using so much less fossil fuel, except for right now, but because there's so much, it's such a political hot potato to own fossil fuel stocks. And the industry is, the long-term, future of the industry doesn't look very good. So, I think that there is a very important place for business and leadership in business to drive change. But I think that pressure from the outside often is very useful to hold companies to their promises. One example I would cite is the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, who has been to this class a couple times. I don't know, Will, have you talked about that model?
We haven't, no.
So the Coalition of Immokalee Workers is a farm worker group. Whoever's in charge here, can you put someone else's face on my screen? Because I'm seeing myself.
Okay.
Okay, much better to look at you and talk to you. It was an interesting effort to organize farm workers in Florida, where the tomato pickers in particular were some of the most exploited farm workers in America. There was slavery on some of these farms. Workers would be brought in from Central America, and they were not paid enough to support the housing they were given, and they would become indentured, and there was sexual abuse in the fields. It was just terrible. And the organizers tried everything to see if they could push these growers. These are tomato packers in Florida. And they did a hunger strike, no reaction. They did a march across Florida, no reaction. And then as, what was his name? I'm trying to remember the name of the work. It was Greg Aspet and I forget the other. And he said to me, or he said to the group, to this class, he said, and then we found the door in the castle wall that we could get through. And what was that door? It was the brand, the corporate brand, not of the tomato packers, because no one knew the names of those companies. They're totally anonymous. But it was the brands of the companies they sold to. It was Wendy's, it was McDonald's, it was Whole Foods, it was Chipotle. And so they focused their campaign on those companies. And essentially, they would have protests at various outlets of these franchises, They would write op-ed pieces embarrassing, you know, their investment bankers in the pages of the New York Times. Do you know you're supporting slavery in Florida with the tomatoes you're buying? And they essentially shamed these corporations, not into negotiating, but into signing a pledge that they wrote. You know, a bill of rights for tomato pickers that included, you know, increases in wages, but also mechanisms so you could report sexual abuse. And, you know, it was a whole list. And they, one by one, they got these corporations to sign on. And the corporations were, in the end, would be boasting about it. And they had enforcement mechanisms. And it really worked. So I think that I think corporations have a huge role to play. They are the great powers in our society, but we have to direct our politics at them too, not just at the government. And that politics directed at driving corporate change. We're seeing many, many examples of how it can work. But if you want to study that, look at the history of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, because they figured something new out. And so far it's working really well.
Yeah, we have a couple of videos of that in the library, in the edible
cool.
library. I think maybe one year when you were teaching, and I think Mark Bittman also had Greg and his colleagues there in class. Sarah Ampalur, are you with us tonight, Sarah? Can you unmute yourself and ask your question of Michael, if you're there? Sarah?
I was unmuted.
There you go.
Thanks, Michael, for coming to speak to us today. Today, my question is about the food distribution system. We've always known that it's unsustainable and sometimes unjust. And in the wake of coronavirus and quarantine measures, this is more than evident with how you mentioned earlier, thousands of pounds are being thrown away, while next door people are unable to access or buy healthy, nutritious food. So do you think right now we have a chance to lastingly fix aspects of the distribution system, and if these changes can realistically be implemented? And how do we make sure that the millions of food insecure people in the country are supported long-term and ultimately lower those numbers?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for asking it, Hannah. There is a moment here where we're focused on distribution. It's, you know, it's the least glamorous part of the food system, right? We love writing about restaurants and farms, but distribution is really, really important. And as we're realizing right now, I think there's an opportunity for innovation in distribution. The system we have now, which really was invented by Walmart, and it's this big hub and spoke system, which was very good for certain kinds of things, and it drove down the price of food, and it allowed them to have this what they call just-in-time inventory, where they don't have to have a lot of stuff around and they can get it really quickly. That system is really, you know, buckling right now. There was and I think we need to go back and look at what did, say, produce or meat distribution look like in the 1950s. Is there any wisdom that we threw out, you know, with the bathwater then when we dumped that system for the current system? And I don't understand it. And somebody with a really good business head and logistics head could look at this question and come up with probably a wonderful business idea for a way. I mean, because if you talk to farmers, small regional farmers, you know, they don't love the farmers market system. It takes them off the farm, you know, for too long, and it's inefficient in certain ways, and they would love to have better ways to distribute their food. So far, we have the CSA model and the, you know, somebody driving their truck to the market or to a restaurant, but there are many farmers who, I mean, some farmers love going to the farmer's market. They're sociable and they love the education that comes with it, but many of them hate it. And so that I think it's a great moment to innovate in distribution. And yeah, in terms of food security, I mean, look, we have this amazing, you know, what we're seeing now is a microcosm of the larger problem. We've always had this problem that, you know, Raj Patel wrote a book called Stuffed and Starved. At the same time, we have overproduction of food, we have starvation all around the world and in the United States. Well, we're seeing that in like Technicolor right now, where you've got these farmers on TV destroying their crops, cut to people lined up, you know, in their cars at food banks for hours waiting to get a box of produce. That's a distribution problem too, obviously. And there is some effort to remedy that. I know in New York, the governor has made it a priority. He was scandalized when he saw yogurt and milk being thrown out, and he's trying to hook up big milk buyers and producers with food banks. And even the federal government, which, you know, on balance has been doing remarkably little through this whole pandemic, is working on this problem because it's just so scandalous. So if you've got a head for it, I think putting some effort into redesigning our food distribution system or coming up with companies that fill in these gaps would be a terrific contribution.
Michael, I'm going to try to paraphrase a couple of questions that came in from the YouTube audience who are not with us in Zoom, but we're live streaming this to YouTube. So one of the questions is, what are your thoughts on how to promote a greater understanding about the need for food system solidarity as we evolve in our approach? And I guess what I take away from that, a related question is, how you just wrote a whole book about how to change your mind.
Yeah.
How do people change their mind about food? How do people's minds change about their relationship to food? And one of the questions that streams in all semester is, hey, I can't afford to eat at the farmer's market. It's so much more expensive than what I'm used to. Or, gee, this is just what I'm used to. This is the diet that I grew up on. So just connecting your work, what do you know? How do we help people change their minds, or how do you lead people to a point where their mind is changed?
Yeah, psychedelics. That's one way. Although I don't know of a case where psychedelics have changed people's minds about food. I have to think about it. It tends to be an appetite suppressant. But, you know, a great meal changes people's minds about food. I mean, there's so many people. I mean, I always have students in my writing classes write about transformative food experience. And many people have had them. And that is the wake-up call. I think getting your hands in the dirt, you know, you and I are both gardeners. I think that creates the kind of excitement and appreciation for the work of farmers, and a sense that there's something really sacred here, that this is not just fuel for the body. This is a, you know, a profound engagement with the natural world. For me, all my work flows out of experiences I had in the garden, and my feelings about food and my excitement about growing food. My first book, Second Nature, is it's a book of essays of, you know, experiences I had in the garden, you know, from having a war with a woodchuck to, you know, learning how to grow food and deal with pests, and the incredible satisfaction that comes when you harvest something that you've planted. And that goes back to when I was very young. When I was 8, I had a garden that I called a farm. So I think our disconnection from nature is part of our disconnection from food. And, you know, yeah, you can't afford the food in the farmer's market, but if you have a little piece of land, if you've got enough space for one raised bed, it could be 2 by 2, you can grow some really cheap food and beautiful food as good as in the farmer's market. And the fact that you'll have a hand in its creation will make it taste better than anything you've ever eaten. So the money argument, you know, I hear you, but there are ways to have profound food experiences without spending a dime.
One thing that's happening and shifting right now is in my community, there's a lot of I call them gardener farmers who were hobbyists, and then they scaled up to be kind of community farmers, and it was their way of interacting with the community. One of them that we like a lot is a man named Ed, and he just grows like the most beautiful lettuce. And he's the guy at the farmer's market where there's actually a line when the bell rings. You know, there's always one booth like that. Everybody else is empty and there's like 12 people in line. Well, Ed decided that he's an older gentleman and he just didn't want to deal with the hassle of the farmer's market. And what he realized was he didn't really know his customers directly. I mean, he knew them by face, but he didn't have a mailing list or anything. So one of his customers, who was really sort of industrious, put a mailing list together of all the community that she knew. So anyway, now he's having this kind of epiphany of like the direct to consumer relationship, and basically sends out his list. You tell him what you want on Monday, and on Wednesday you can drive by and it's in a little box and you can pick it up. And I actually did that today. And you know, to this, I just always want to challenge this farmer's market is too expensive. We got $10 worth of food and it's going to be about 8 meals, you know, between the chard and the broccoli and the lettuce and you know, just interesting to me too, that I think he's able to charge a little less because he doesn't now have the markup and the pain of the farmer's market.
Or spending the whole day there.
Yeah.
And you also have the CSA box, which is farmer's market quality food. And it's considerably less expensive.
Right.
And the reason is, of course, that the farmer is giving you what he has a lot of, or she has a lot of, right? And so you don't get to choose, which presents certain, I think, really interesting challenges to the home cook. It's like, oh, you know, I'm gonna consult my cookbooks, which I never look at because I got to figure out what to do with kohlrabi. And you also end up eating things you wouldn't buy, but why don't you buy it? Just because you don't know what to do with it. And here you're kind of, I don't know, it just expands your repertoire.
One of the students I spoke to this afternoon in an office hour told me how much more confident she is now cooking. Like that this whole experience has been transformative because it really tested her and pushed her. And now she's at a whole new level of confidence and creativity. And
you know, one of the silver linings of what's happening is finally this renaissance of home cooking that Alice has been talking about. I wrote a whole book about trying to generate. We didn't realize it would take a virus, but people are cooking a lot and getting great pleasure out of it. It's one of the most fun things you can do under quarantine. And you know, but that goes back to that first thing I said. When the shelter in place is lifted, will people hold on to those habits, or will they just be eager to go back to, you know, going out to dinner all the time? I'm sure people miss going out to dinner, and they will do that when they feel safe doing it. On the other hand, a certain number of people will have picked up habits that will stick with them. I mean, all the people learning how to bake bread right now, Instagram is full of like loaves of bread, and this incredible pride people feel when they can. And indeed, you can't find, you know, flour in the supermarket right now, or yeast is apparently in short supply. So I'm hoping that will be one of the residues. That people have rediscovered the pleasure of cooking, which, by the way, is the cheapest way to eat. You know, so if you're not going to restaurants, maybe then you can afford to shop at the farmer's market. Because if you're cooking yourself, I mean, it becomes very economical, especially if you're cooking every day. I think something that I've come to really appreciate these days, where I'm cooking every meal, is that when you can roll one meal over into the next, where you can make, you know, a pot of beans, and then the next day they become refried beans, or they become part of the soup. This whole, and you know, we're eating out of our refrigerator, and because we're trying to avoid going to the market very often, and that there is so many different ways to use the same ingredients, and we always make more than we're going to eat, so we have leftovers, and so there's I think that and the waste that, you know, one of the reasons people don't like to cook is that they end up, they feel like they waste a lot of food, that they've got, you know, sad celery in the bottom of the refrigerator, and they end up throwing away this stuff. Well, if you're cooking every day, you're not throwing away that stuff. You're putting it in a soup. You're putting it in a stir fry. You're figuring out a way to use it. And so it becomes very economical and very efficient.
Let's just spend the last few minutes. There's a number of questions that kind of get at this concentration of power. We'll go back to that. And in your piece, you kind of summarize this notion that we're trading off efficiency for resiliency, but resiliency is also kind of a synonym for health and well-being too, in many ways. And so
it's not celebrated in, you know, the Harvard Business Review the way efficiency is.
That's true. So how, you know, if we were to think about this moment with the meat packing plants, what are the levers in the system that, you know, can be adjusted or pressured or, you know, changed?
Yeah. So I think the most important is antitrust. A word that has become kind of exotic or archaic to a lot of people. But, you know, we have a set of laws that were passed during the, you know, Theodore Roosevelt era of reform that recognized that if corporations got too powerful in a given marketplace, it was really bad for society. It was bad for a couple of reasons. One is consumers might get screwed through price fixing and things like that. And producers who sell into those corporations might get screwed because they don't have choice of where to take their animals or whatever it is. But in a larger sense, letting such power grow and fester was a risk to the republic. That if you have companies so powerful they can force the president to force their workers back on the line, there's something wrong in the polity. Now, beginning in the 1980s, these laws were reinterpreted by the Reagan administration. And they basically said, this was a Justice Department interpretation that Judge Bork was involved with, actually. And they said basically, as long as the consumer wasn't harmed, and that was a price question, as long as the prices weren't going to go up, we would not forbid companies from consolidating, from merging. And so the sole standard for antitrust became price. And if prices were going down, then it was fine. You could have one airline, you could have one meatpacking plant. And that interpretation, which again is not in law, but it has been followed by every administration since, has given us this world that we're in right now. When the meat packers all consolidated, prices didn't go up. Prices to farmers went down because they had the clout. They could force the farmers to take prices because the farmers didn't have a lot of other places to go, the ranchers especially. But the consumer made out okay. Meat got cheaper, and meat in America is very cheap because of the efficiencies and because of concentration. We need to return to a time where we look at antitrust through the broader original lens with which it was written, which is this too much political power? And is this screwing the producers, the farmers who are selling into this system?
So is the root cause there go back to campaign finance reform, or?
Well, I think that makes it more difficult, but Elizabeth Warren understands this very well. And if she were the Attorney General or the Vice President, the Justice Department could simply write an interpretation of antitrust rules, and then the scrutiny of every deal going forward would look at those other questions also. And the Justice Department could decide that having only 4 meat packers is really bad for ranchers, and really bad for the republic, for our politics, because it's that concentration that leads to these floods of money into the system. Now, it'll be very controversial, and it'll be very hard to break up these companies. But make no mistake, Facebook and Amazon realize that if there is a Democrat elected, that they're going to come under this kind of scrutiny, because this thinking is starting to shift. So that's what I think has to happen. It sounds like a big ask, but it's just a memo. That's all we need, is a memo in the Justice Department, and a lot could change.
Maybe your next piece, you could write that memo. And
yeah, that's good. There are people that know more about this than I do. Yeah. If you want to learn more about it, there's a wonderful book called Cornered by a journalist named Barry Lynn, Lynn. And he has been on a crusade about this for as long as I've known him. And he has the ear of Elizabeth Warren on these questions.
Well, Michael, we're grateful for your presence tonight and the continuity of being involved in the class. This is a beautiful kind of final evening for us. I mentioned this piece a couple of times.
Yeah.
Maybe when it's published, we can circulate the link to everybody.
That'd be great. I will make sure to send it to you, Will. I mean, It was written for the New York Review of Books, but it'll be online. And assuming that they accept it. But I will, as soon as it's available, I will make it available to you, and I hope you will distribute it. That would be great.
Well, thank you.
What a pleasure to be here. And congratulations on finishing your term. It's always a wonderful feeling. I finished my semester yesterday.
Well, I will drink to that.
That's great.
And Alice, thank you for your unending support and encouragement. And
thank you, Alice. And thanks to the students. Thank you so much for listening. And here's to a great summer and a really committed fall.
Fantastic. Good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bill, thank you.
Bye.
So much.
Thank you.
Best wishes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Will.
You're welcome.
Yes.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Thanks, Will.
And you're all the things my friend said about Michael Pollan.
Will's on mute.
Good night, everyone.
No, I'm.
Have a good end of your semester. Bye-bye.